Well, my phenomenal guest this morning is a man that has been my hero since my college days. I was in college in 1947 when the news broke that the sound barrier had been broken. Wow. What a piece of history. Chuck Yeager has been my hero all my life since that day. Boy, you know, he really became the person God wanted him to be and to do what God wanted done. And he picked the right man. He's continued his work. He's never retired, really, until I think his last flight in uniform in a military jet was the year he turned 80. For 60 years, he's been sitting in the cockpits of military aircraft. If he's not in the Guinness Book of Records, he could, but that would not be much of an honor compared to what he's received. The greatest honors the country can give, the Medal of Freedom is the greatest, and a Congressional Gold Medal, I believe. And only last month was given a second star as a general by a special act of Congress. How about that? General.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Wow.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schuller. I'm a little bit out of my element here, but the only thing I can lord over you, I've been a lot closer to heaven than you have. So.
That's fantastic. Wow.
And one thing, a couple years ago, in fact, 2.5 years ago, in October 2002, I made my last flight in military airplanes, wound up 60 years in the cockpit, fought in 4 wars, and turned 80. And I said, you know, I think I'll quit. Air Force took a picture of me by an F-15E, a Strike Eagle, one of our best airplanes today to fight in, and I signed this to you. It wasn't big enough for me to put all of my admiration for you on, but I just signed it and gave it to you. Thank you, sir.
Keep up the good, wow.
Thank you.
To Dr. Schuller, keep up the good work, General Chuck Yeager. You know, I have signed photographs from all the presidents going back, including Nixon, but this tops them all because you are a doer of greatest things. Tell me, General, where do we begin? Breaking the sound barrier. What was that important to you?
Well, basically, the sound barrier from the days of the Wright brothers' first flight, man had progressed in speed for years. And finally, during World War II, we were developing airplanes that would go about 80% of the speed of sound. And at this point, shock waves began forming on the airplane, and we run into a lot of buffeting and loss of control. And it was a so-called, as a lot of people call it, a barrier. And our Air Force back in 1944, knowing this, developed the X-1 and had Bell Aircraft Company build it. And I returned from World War II. I was flying Mustangs against the Germans over there in 43, 44, and 45, and got shot down. I also shot a dozen or so down. And I came home, and I was gifted in maintenance. My dad taught me mechanics, and I used to work on his trucks and the like. Well, I was a maintenance officer at Wright Field. He used to put on air shows, and so finally, the Air Force completed the X-1 and picked the crew, and I was picked as the primary pilot on the X-1 to try to get the airplane above the speed of sound. And the reason I was picked is because I obviously could fly an airplane. I'd lived through a war, and I also understood mechanics, and it was very important that we get above the speed of sound because it was a barrier, and once we got beyond sound, it would open up space to us.
Is it true that the night before you were to take off and break the sound barrier, that you really had a bad accident?
You really know how to hurt a guy, don't you? So, no, I did. Glennis and I were out at Poncho Barnes, a local watering hole, and except he didn't drink water. And so she and I went horseback riding after dinner, and we were racing back, and some idiot had closed the gate, and I was on it before I saw the gate, and I laid my horse over and pulled about 6 G's, and he spun out and went through the fence, and I was thrown off and broke a couple ribs. And in the X1, it was hanging under a B-29 mothership, and you had to take off in the B-29 up on a coke box sitting behind the pilot. And then once you got up to about 12,000 feet, you went back and went down on a ladder and crawled in the side of the X1, and then Jack Ridley, my flight test engineer, bring the door down, put it against. And when I told Jack, I said, man, I got a problem. After I found out I had 2 broken ribs, I wouldn't go to the flight surgeon on the base because he'd ground me. I went to a veterinarian in Roseman. He said, you got a couple broken ribs, don't do anything strenuous. This is the day before I'm supposed to fly the X1 on the first supersonic flight. So Jack, we looked this thing over, and this arm that you lock the door on, I couldn't do it with my right arm. He cut a piece of broomstick off about 10 inches long that I could stick in the handle with my left hand and close it. And it worked out all right. I made a decision, and it was right. But that's the way it is, you know. You do what you can with what you've got, and it basically went with.
Fantastic. I've never met another person that I felt lived out in his life what I've been trying to teach in 35 books. You're a sensation. Weren't you afraid? Come on.
Well, no.
I mean, you didn't. There were those who said that if a body went through the sound barrier, it could disintegrate.
Dr. Schuller, your job is religion. My job is airplanes. And I concentrate on what I'm doing. And if I run into problems, I concentrate 100% on getting out of that problem. And that's the reason I'm here today, is that I understood more about the machinery that I was flying, plus egress systems like ejection seats and pressure suits, than the guys that manufactured them, because I had to use them in a sort of a semi-conscious state. So what I do, I focus, when I have a problem, I focus on getting out of the situation, because you're wasting your time thinking ahead. You better concentrate on what you're doing. That's the way I lived.
Wow.
And I was raised in a religious family, and the cowboy preachers used to come through West Virginia and pitch a tent and preach and pass a plate and make enough money to go to the next town. And they'd keep score on how can they save more people than was saved by the previous preacher. And it's rather, I'd get, saved 2 or 3 times a night. You always get drowned when they baptized you in the river, but that's just the way it was back in the hills of West Virginia.
Last night you said to me you were saved how many times before you got out of town? 20?
Quite a few. I tell things the way I remember them. Sometimes that's not necessarily the way it happened, but that's the way it goes. No, I was raised in a family that my father taught me, my father, I was raised to honor my flag and my country, and I was taught what was right from wrong, and that's the way youngsters were, and that's the way I've lived my life. Airplanes in the Air Force, combat duty. Duty's paramount in everything you do, and that's the way I've lived.
In the movie The Right Stuff, I remember, I think you were heading for Mach 2 or something, and it seems like you went out in a daze, and it looked like you were headed for a fatal crash. Recall.
Don't remind me. So,
did you were scared then, weren't you? Come on, be honest.
No, here again, you do not waste your time being scared. You concentrate on what you're doing.
Boy, that's good.
When the X-1A, we got out to about 2.5 Mach at 80,000 feet, and it begins to tumble because we had too small a tail. It's the first time we'd been out there. Well, I don't know what's wrong. I don't have an ejection seat. I can't get out of the airplane, and I just thought, man, either the tail has come off, and I was taking quite a beating, and I'd busted my canopy, and my pressure chute inflated because I was up above 50,000 feet, and I just wrote it down. The first thing I recognized was an inverted spin. Well, spins to us are something we live with, and popped it into normal spin and popped out of it at 25,000 feet, and kind of shook my head and looked around, found the lake bed over at Rogers, went over and made a straight in, landed, and they got a new pilot and new canopy on the airplane, went ahead with the program.
Wow.
But that's research flying, you know, and research airplanes, we've been able to stay ahead of the operational airplanes by about 5 years, so that we end up, when we build an airplane to fight with, like the F-15 at Mach 2, we know all the answers that we've gotten with research airplanes. And I was lucky enough to live through all of them. I was talented enough to take advantage of it, and that's, you know, good Lord smiles on you once in a while.
I want to say something, and that is your unmatched career, but with it, something that's phenomenal. A wonderful marriage until your wife died from cancer. How long were you married?
45 years, and she died in 1990. And then I met Victoria, my wife, that I have today, and we were married about a year and a half ago, and she's a big help. And I'm getting old, you know.
Congress, by special act, gave you a second star, General. When did that happen?
About 2 months ago. You know, it's not. I'm not as happy as you would believe I would be, because the last paragraph says, "No change in pay or benefits." So, but it's quite an honor, because on the same bill that they passed, they put General Billy Mitchell, who was a hero of mine from the 30s, you know, and who did a tremendous amount of work. And so we'll get up and get a piece of paper, and no money stuck to it, but that's the way it goes.
Your definition of faith is what I finally have spelled out in my new book, and I want to give you a copy. It's Don't Throw Away Tomorrow. Boy, you never did. Don't throw away tomorrow. You didn't retire until 60 years of flying in a cockpit. Don't throw away tomorrow. You never did. Norman Peale invited you to speak in his church. He's the father of this ministry. And you talked about faith, didn't you?
Yes. Yeah, and you know, thanks a lot. I know I've listened to you many, many times, and basically, as you get older, you're what, 86? You know, as I'm 82 now.
And I'm 78.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, heck, I started saying over, but heck, I don't even buy green bananas. I'm afraid they won't get ripe before I die. So, well, it's wonderful that you would invite Victoria and I down, and you have a marvelous audience. It's a lot of people here, and you have a very talented young son, not young, but son. Thank you, sir.
Fastest man alive.